The mysterious quanta of energy have made their appearance. Whitehead, Process and Reality. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth then was welter and waste and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovered over the waters. God said, Bereshit, in the beginning of. In the beginning, there was an interruption, a rupture, a break in the continuum of time before time, a disruption, a hesitation, a pause, a stutter, a disjointure, a cut. In the beginning of, before we even get to the beginning of, there is a break that disrupts the very possibility of origin and the unlinear unfolding of in the beginning. That was an originary discontinuity that breaks open the continuum of time before it gets started, before there is a beginning. This beginning, like all beginners, is always already threatened through the anticipation of where it is going, but will never simply reach, and of a past that has yet to come. It is not merely that the future and the past are not there and never sit still, but that the present is not simply here now.
Starting at the beginning always involves some sleight of hand, some chicanery. Take, for example, the conventional blues opening. I woke up this morning, baby was gone. We get grabbed by the ear and raced along. All this before we can ask, what happened the night before? It's a sonic device closely analogous to the folklore and fairy tale opening Once Upon a Time. These are performances or speech acts which catch us very swiftly and very efficiently. For all its ancient authority, even the Bereshit, the beginning of the beginning in Genesis, functions as a hustle. It announces an opening by creating an illusion that all that came before it was silence, just as the noisiest barroom can be retrofitted with the illusion of silence by the piano opening. Oh! So when we hear the words, in the beginning, or some physicists reasoning for the Big Bang, or we hear the oh! Our attention is put to work in a very specific way, something like selecting the temporal gear in which the vehicle must get rolling or else it will stall. We're slipping the clutch of our credulity. Whenever a front end to silence or a beginning of meaning is announced, we know that somebody wrote that language, or some cosmologist applied that mathematics, and somebody made that piano out of wood and metal long before a performer hammered out the which suggests a question. Is the silence before the beginning of the music and the silence of the divinity before the Bereshit a case of retrograde anticipation?
In silence, something changes. For with your question you have brought me into that same darkness, into that same cloud of unknowing where I would you were yourself.
In his collection of poems titled Next to Nothing, Paul Bowles has this. there is a way to master silence, control its curves, inhabit its dark corners, and listen to the hiss of time outside. Not what is meant, and far away from why.
I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end, but I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. Beginning is going on everywhere amidst all the endings so rarely ripe already. They show up late, these beginnings bristling with promise, yet laboured and doomed. Every last one of them is lovingly addressed in the beginning. But if such talk of the beginning and the end has produced the poles, the boundary markers of a close totality, if the beginning has blocked the disruptive infinities of becoming, then theology had better get out of its own way. In the beginning, theology starts again. If something becomes, it is not what was before. Genesis, a becoming text, a text of becoming, an unfinished narrative, is not a replication or a rearrangement. Always again there arises an element of the unprecedented. Does the new not come in this sense from nothing? Sound and silence are both capable of conducting us into unknown spaces. In entering unknown spaces, there is often a change in who we are. There is no view from nowhere, and a frame of reference determines what will count as real. In the words of the evolutionary biologist Bruce H. Lipton, I quote, "You may consider yourself an individual, but as a cell biologist, I can tell you that you are in truth a cooperative community of approximately 50 trillion single-celled citizens." End quote.
We are never alone in silence, and perhaps our profound uncertainty about who or what else is in there with us explains something of the holy and unholy dread that silence can invoke. Silence can be like anything because it is like nothing. So when the psychologist Paul Goodman talks of 9 kinds of silence, he is, to my mind, being as mean as the people who say that we have 5 and only 5 senses. I'm more inclined towards an active and infinitely fertile nothing, a silence which negates even itself and so can speak in a zillion ways between any 2 notes or words or...
Does the new not come in this sense from nothing? Are we not created from this nothing, the bottomless shadow tomb or womb of ourselves? We are created from everything, exclaims a friend, gazing at his newborn child. He is thinking of the dust of stars, species and genes, of histories and personalities, recycled in the unpredictable little Nova, folded like a bud in his arms. In the face of the infinities of creation, then, the present work makes an infinitesimal move to open up a possibility hitherto shut into the second verse of the Bible.
Nothing.
One of the ways I like to think about our experience of silence is as a real sensation of an unreal force. This sounds a bit abstract and mystical, but I hope I can explain. In a vehicle, you turn a corner at speed. The elderly and reckless among you may remember when seat belts were not compulsory and you could slide the full width of a car. This sideways motion is attributed to centrifugal force, an undeniable sensation of being pushed to the side. But in a scientific sense, there is no centrifugal force. It's not a force, it's a kind of anti-force, inertia. There is only a sideways motion in your own bodily relation to the frame of reference, in this case the car body. What's happening, and what is plain to an observer outside your local frame of reference, is that your body is tending to move along the same straight line going forwards, while the car, your frame of reference, swerves aside. It's not a perfect analogy, but with sound, our frame of reference is created by the attention we give to a cluster of frequencies, cadences, and so forth. We experience silence when there is a sharp enough downward curve in the amplitude of the item we're paying attention to, and our attention has not yet recalibrated to make the background sounds into a new frame of reference. We know silence. We do not hear silence, we know it. Forces which are, in terms of physics and acoustics, unreal, are nevertheless aesthetically, somatically, perfectly real. I don't want to offer a definition of what silence is, but would like to note one of the many things that the unreal can do. Silence can grant us an uncanny sensation of something passing while we adjust between sonic frames of reference. Whatever that something passing is, it's not quite time. In chemical terms, silence can act as a catalyst. In an alchemical frame of reference, it's an agent of transformation, like the river of mercury between two metals, or the universal solvent between the crystallized time of fixed things and events. Transformation of the self is possible whenever we encounter a change in the frame of reference and pay close attention to it.
She would slide down with her voice just before ending. On her way down, she took her time. There was sensuous temptation in the silence. There was a force in her silenced sound. Then, when she got everybody's attention, she spoke. She put on a spell. She put a spell on them. They burned into their seats, as if speaking words of divinity. During the moment of silence, at that point, she knew. She was someone else. Silence created many words. Silence, a paradox, as everything else in her. So be silent. And do not chatter about God. For when you chatter about him, you are telling lies and sinning. Silence, writes Eliot Wolfson on Jewish mysticism, is not to be set in binary opposition to language, but is rather the margin that demarcates its center. Silence folds in and out of speech as breath folds in and out, inspiration and expiration, spirit in Hebrew, Greek and Latin, meaning breath. Inspiration and expiration of the body. Of the body. I am always a dual being. On the one hand, a passive being who is subject to the world, and on the other hand, an active being who has a grasp on it. Can I attain perfect wisdom, wisdom in action that would reunite the two parts of myself? I certainly cannot unite them directly, since the presence of the world in my thoughts is precisely what the powerlessness consists of. But I can unite them indirectly, since this and nothing else is what action consists of. Not the appearance of action, through the uncontrolled imagination that makes me blindly turn the world upside down by means of my anarchic desire. But real action, indirect action, or to give it its true name, work.
Breathwork. Breathwork has undeniable advantages at the limits of human experience, as anyone involved with childbirth, physical combat, experimental sexuality, and pain management can tell you. The practices of breathwork significantly predate scientific method. This is a blessing and a curse. On the plus side, this deep somatic history ensures that this remains a fertile zone for practical research. On the negative side, there is halitosis, a new age plague of bad breath work, such as crude hyperventilation techniques alleged to mimic psychedelic experiences. These seem to work only for people with no experience of psychedelics. In the clamour of mystical claims, learning to remember your past life in Atlantis and whatnot, the most obvious experience is often overlooked. We are all moved by the organisation of breath. In chant and even rough popular song, in and by speech of course, but the most modest, obvious and vital point is that we're literally animated by breath, yet so few of us choose to explore the process. Without a teacher or a guru, without any requirement of belief, all of us have equal and open access to this pneumatic laboratory, which we are.
It is through work that reason grasps the world itself and masters the uncontrolled imagination, only through the intermediary of the world. Through the intermediary of the work do I reunite them. For if through work I do not unite the two parts of myself, the one that undergoes and the one that acts, I at least can cause the changes I undergo to be produced by me, so that what I am subject to is my own action. I must use cunning. I must impede myself by using obstacles that steer me where I want to go.
The subject and object syntax of Indo-European languages has caused much mischief. According to its frames of reference, there are subjects and objects, which is to say, the world and you. Breath carries our words. It carries our meanings, while at the same time short-circuiting our presuppositions about the ontologies which are embedded in our languages.
I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end.
Okay, let's risk breaking the frame a little bit here and just play about with the word for a while. Ruach.
Ruach.
Just see how the word fits into bodily space, in the mouth, in the sinuses, in the lungs.
Outwards, centrifugal movement.
That is a wonderfully material word for me.
Inwards, centripetal movement.
Not semantically related, but it seems physiologically related to a word like rausch or rush, a sacred thrill. A phoneme that can only really be said on the exhale takes your breath away as you say it. Rausch, ruach. I don't think it can be said on the inhale particularly coherently at all. It just breaks when you try to say it breathing in rather than out.
Can anyone make the ru sound while breathing inwards? Sounding like a sleepy wolf while continuing a mad walk, thinking of being a dancer. More.
Ouch. It's quite painful at the back of the throat, and the whole head wiggles, the eyeballs vibrate, like you're at a bad dentist's if you try to do this at volume. Oh, from any frame of reference, that that feels like it's against God, nature, and reason all at once, doesn't it?
So the r can be louder, but it is impossible to develop the r.
Ouch.
While breathing inwards.
The space of your physiology are very much against it.
It is like the gasp of a dying weasel.
The professional laboratories which took over from the alchemical private laboratories in the last 400 years have fenced off the idea of experimentation as a workspace. An alchemical laboratory was a temenos, a sacred space, but a place for play as much as work. Life and work were integrated. So too with work in the pneumatic laboratory of the body. The exclusive disjunction between work and play is short-circuited. The space of the body is perhaps the last zone one is allowed to have a private laboratory without being keenly investigated by the authorities. It's a play space, but also a risky space, inasmuch as we do not know what will happen until we earnestly attempt it. Experimentation with breathing is a subversive activity, literally turning from underneath. We're all free to breathe. What is amazing is how few of us use the freedom or the space to explore and experiment. Take what seems to be a single point and approach it from a slightly different space, the space of meaning rather than materiality. Ru.
Taking a breath for a walk. In and out. In and out. In and out.
French. A street or a way.
Two seemingly simple points of departure. And a point of departure differs from a mathematical point in that it is always double. Double at the very least.
Wander around the meanings of the word ru.
Ru, ru, rolling in, reeling out. Ru, a street away. Ru, a breath away, a street away. Also, ru means a wrinkle and a regret.
Ru.
And a medicine to heal wounds.
Ru.
And so on. And so on.
A butter-based sauce in cooking. A baby kangaroo. A street, a path, a way. In Chinese, the Tao.
It could be said that these meanings are tangential. And perhaps they are. A linguist may say that they are arbitrary links of signifier to signified. But in a sense, everything we do is at some tangent to breathing. At least, everything we do after we have left the waters of the womb. Alongside the myths and the theology, we can find this biological substratum, which is a material link and also a separation of the breath and the water.
I was invited to a Buddhist philosophy session in which the practice of bodhicitta was discussed in relation to mantra and a form of devotion called the lotus walking dharani. This involves a synchronization of breath, chant, walking, and visualization of a lotus flower blooming beneath every step one takes, an integration of several senses. One aspect of the Buddhist session seemed especially relevant, that the combined bodily practices of chant, walking and meditation were about nothing. One practitioner described the dharani as follows: it is walking with the vibe of emptiness. It is not necessary to acknowledge any meaning while reciting the mantra. The recitation itself is the important thing. The walking is the destination. The destination is the walking. The lotus dharani is a way of experiencing the means as the results, and the results as a means. I was immediately reminded of the words of the artist Paul Klee. In his pedagogical sketchbooks of 1925, he describes the first and most fundamental category of a line as an active line on a walk, moving freely, without goal. The Manchester artist Neil Greenhalgh expands upon this. Drawings and walks can be either purposeful to reach a certain end or purposeless for their own sake. If you set out with the intention of being led on an imaginary walk through moving the pencil across the paper, you can transcend linear time and delve into the world of the imagination and memory, where space and time exist on wholly different planes. End quote. These spaces include fantasy space, memory space, and many more kinds of spaces, some of which have names, many more do not. Taking a line for a walk, taking a breath for a walk, in and out, two seemingly simple points of departure.
But I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now.
A space may be a frame of reference, but there are gaps between frames of reference. Musicians among you will almost certainly have experienced these other spaces, other times, the zones where spaces and times themselves become variable materials instead of abstract containers with measured sides. As with mystical experience, it is easier to talk of this negatively, not the tempo, not the shift between modes, not rhythm nor chronology, but a zone which is different to the metrics of its description. It can feel thick or light, granular or bendy, loose or tense. It seems closely related to synesthesia because it sounds like nonsense when you try to language it up. It can only be spoken of obliquely, tangentially. Like silence, it is not heard, it is known. Though they are resistant to cognitive mapping, such spaces can be sensed, and perhaps can only be sensed as a lived experience and not as a description.
Nothing ever begins. There is no first moment, no single word or place from which this or any story springs. The threads can always be traced back to some earlier tale, and the tales that precede that. Though as the narrator's voice recedes, the connection will seem to grow more tenuous, for each age will want the tale told as if it were of its own making.